Happy spring! I'm Dan Pertu. For this latest episode of my Muse and Music video blog, I am so excited to be interviewing flutist Brook Ferguson about her listening list for quarantine. We also talk about various issues pertaining to new music, particularly the diversity of compositional styles present nowadays. Brook has been hailed by the Washington Post as brilliantly virtuosic. She is a versatile solo and orchestral artist, as well as a sought after teacher. Brook has performed as a concerto soloist with the Colorado Symphony, the New World Symphony, the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, and the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. She was appointed principal flutist of the Colorado Symphony Orchestra in 2010 and has been principal flutist of the groundbreaking River Oaks Chamber Orchestra since 2012. Previously, she completed a 3-year fellowship with the New World Symphony, where she had the privilege of working with Michael Tilson Thomas and many other great musicians and conductors. She has made principal appearances with the Singapore Symphony, Aspen Chamber Symphony and Festival Orchestra, Grand Teton Festival Orchestra, Seattle Symphony, and the Pittsburgh Symphony. Prior to her appointment with the New World Symphony, she was acting principal flutist of the Knoxville Symphony and principal flutist of the Delaware Symphony. She has also performed at the Marlborough Music Festival and the Tanglewood Music Center. She is currently the professor of flute at Utah State University and has founded the Bel Canto Flute Academy in Denver, hosting community performance events for flutists of all ages and abilities. Let's have a listen to her as she discusses her listening list for quarantine. Great. Well, I'm really excited to be talking now with Brook Ferguson, who is the principal flute of the Colorado Symphony and also the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, ROCO. So I'm really pleased to talk with her about new music and her listening list, of course, during these weird quarantine times, and what is still inspiring about new music during these difficult times and what we can take from this. So welcome, and I want to hear your suggestions for people. So.
Well, good morning. When this will be timeless when you post it on the interwebs, but it is morning time. So good morning to you. It's lovely to be here. I think it's a great question. How does one entertain oneself when it's a sort of self-imposed prison, or, I mean, depending on what level you take it to. I've actually done reading online about what do people in solitary confinement do to stay sane, if it's to that level, just saying, like, there must be something out there that we could draw upon to learn from in those situations. But all joking aside, I think music is something that can be very enjoyable, and it's something we all miss. Live performances are the relational aspect of this type of instrumental music making. And, it's well missed. There are some places who've been able to continue to some degree live streaming and performances of musicians. And certainly I've been closely involved with all of those types of protocols that are being followed. I think I've been tested almost every single week since September. And I've been surviving, but there have been some live performances that were broadcast. I know Colorado Symphony is doing more of production style. ROCO's doing more of a live streaming style. So I've seen two different organizational approaches to the same issue. But in terms of staying home and listening lists for most people, I would say live streaming would be a good place to start, just to feel connected with things that are actually happening in the present. There is still life. There is still premieres happening, things, notable things that are happening. So I thought that this would be a kind of fun time to talk about ROCO.
Yeah.
In particular, I am the principal flutist of the Colorado Symphony as well. It seems as if we are targeting our community more in terms of what this Colorado community would want. Whereas in ROCO, it's a little bit more about new music, just more generally. So a chamber orchestra is so much more modular. It's a completely different organizational structure, which lends itself to this type of work. Whereas the Colorado Symphony is a bit more traditional in the structure in terms of the way the budget lays out and how that affects how we present and how we connect. But for the purpose of a quarantine listening list, I thought that my work in ROCO would be exciting and fun for people to hear about. So I joined Roco, I believe it was in 2012, although I'm pretty sure that all of these new commissions warp my sense of time because every time I'm going down there, we're doing something that I've never done before. And quite honestly, even some of the classical pieces, or classical as in the time period of the music that we do, the Haydn symphonies and Mozart symphonies and things, are not something I do all the time in the Colorado Symphony. So even those works sometimes are new to me in terms of playing. So I joke that I think it was 2012. I started as a guest principal. My friend and Professor Christina Jennings was playing principal flute there from the time she'd been at Rice. And then she came to CU Boulder here. So we became good friends. And she said that she wanted me to fill in for her once a year because their February concerts, which are also conductorless, were during auditions for CU Boulder. And it was just difficult for her to take that time to come down then, which, as a newly appointed professor at Utah State, I get it. This time of year is bananas. So I went down there for the first time, and it was my first Roco appearance was without a conductor in a chamber orchestra. So there's a lot of leadership involved in that from the principal flute chair. It was so funny. And I remember Alicia leaning over to me and saying, "I'm going to pop your bubble," because because we didn't really know each other. I was kind of like focused in my own little world. And so she would just lean over and go, "Pop, pop." So, which was great. So that was my introduction to Roco. And then that went on, I think, one more season. I filled in the conductorless. And then I guess Christina Jennings decided that her priorities and responsibilities had shifted to really focusing on things at CU and here and other things in her career. So I was on the phone with Alicia, and she said, "Well, why don't you have principal flute of Roco in your bio?" And I said, "Because I'm just a guest principal." And she's like, "No, you're not. You're the principal flute player." And I was like, "Really? That's news to me." So that's kind of how that all.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, I know. I was like, "What?" And it was just one of those bizarre moments. It was a little awkward, but also hilarious. And upon looking back on it, completely in keeping with my relationship with Alicia. So it's all started then. And I didn't know the depth of new music that I'd be involved in this ensemble. I really didn't know much about River Oaks Chamber Orchestra at the time. Now it's Roco. But they've been doing commissions since day one, the 15th season now, and there's just a long spreadsheet of different premieres, co-commissions, and original commissions. But since I started a bit later in the game, I missed about half of what had been done before me. So I can only comment on the things really that I've played. And we did an amazing project, which was scheduled to be recorded at Round Top, a beautiful concert hall. And we scheduled it for, I believe, is August of 2017, which was Harvey time. So I remember sitting at home and preparing all of this music, because some of these pieces we recorded were things I hadn't played. They were from the earlier days. So it's the middle of August, which is quite frequently a time where I put the flute in the case for a couple of weeks. And so I was coming back to the instrument and a little stressed, a little stressed about things. So I was working, and then I see this hurricane coming in, and I think, what? So then it became not only just concentrating on being prepared, but also keeping an eye out for, is this actually going to happen? Is this a good use of my time at this moment? So it turned out that it was not a good time to do it. So a project that had been in the planning phases for, I think, about 3 years and on a dime could not happen. But Alicia Lawyer I know it was a little rough, but at the same time, seeing the extent of the damage in Houston, it was kind of easy to put it in perspective, right?
Right.
So Alicia, not to be outdone by a hurricane, somehow managed to move the producer and moved all of the equipment and everything into St. John's, where we normally perform. And we canceled our April concert and instead did the recording session in our normal home with everything that she would have had before. So we ended up doing it, but just a bit postponed. So that album is called Visions Take Flight.
Okay.
And it's a beautiful recording. It received a Grammy for Best Producer. Our friend Blanton, who takes really great care of us at really, that was awesome. So it does have a Grammy attached to it, although it's not necessarily for the compositions or whatever, but for the sound.
That's
But it
great.
go ahead. I
That's
know,
so
whatever,
great. Yeah.
it's on the list. It's on the list now. So that recording was a sort of composite portrait of all of the orchestra members' favorite commissions that we had done.
Uh-huh.
And so we received a survey monkey about a year before the project asking us, what were your favorite pieces that we've done? And the response to that survey was so strong for the pieces that we actually ended up recording, that there was really a very special thing. That I think that those choices came from not only the sound world and the uniqueness of those works, or how solid they were felt, but also how much fun they were to play and how much fun they were to experience for the first time. And that might have had more of an impression on us as musicians. Sometimes we think less about the overall picture and more about how it felt while we were in it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny that really brought a sense of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, consensus. Mm-hmm. And but as a special tribute to Harvey and all of the adversity Houstonians had faced, Anthony DiLorenzo composed a piece called Houston Strong, which is a beautiful anthem style piece. It's actually subtitled Anthem of Hope, and very accessible, gorgeous, very inspiring piece. Short, lovely piece, just in tribute to all the first responders and to the citizens of Houston who lived through Harvey, which was very difficult. And so that was a special thing that came out of a very adverse situation that would not have otherwise been there. So a silver lining for that work. Sure. But there were a few things that we chose that I wanted to talk about. There were a couple of string pieces, but the wind pieces that I really enjoyed were Marcus Moroney's Concerto for Orchestra, which is just really well structured, very succinct, fun to play, rhythmic, a lot of woodwind things happening, and just a big display of what that ensemble is capable of doing. So nobody was left behind. Everybody had something, as most concertos for orchestra imply. Yeah. And then there was Mark Bueller's Whirligig, which was basically based on train whistles and movement, locomotive movement. And when we read it, I think it's maybe 2.5 minutes long. But I was just, when I was practicing at tempo and getting ready, and then we sat down and played it, it was just so delightful to play and technically challenging. And some of the hardest parts were balancing flute and clarinet and all the little entrances and matching them. And that was fabulous.
So I want to just ask one thing while you're bringing these up. It's really interesting listening to you talk about them. And one theme I'm noticing is the importance of how the orchestra is reacting to the new composition, and how the musicians' enthusiasm for the composition in terms of how they're performing it and interacting with it then impacts both the performance and, of course, the audience's experience. Maybe could you talk a little bit about that? Because that seems to be a really important theme in what you're saying.
It's true. And I think maybe our biases as musicians might influence how we engage with a piece, depending on what we like in terms of harmonic language or rhythmic language or orchestration. Individual levels of patience could have a lot to do with it as well. But I think on the whole, when everybody is engaged in their part and has something to do, it's that everybody has a playground, everybody has a jungle gym that they're trying to get around on. And so you can get into a flow state a little bit better. And that experience, I think, when everybody's having it versus just a few people and everyone else is kind of just waiting, that creates a little bit more of an ensemble enthusiasm. And who's on the podium helps a lot too. We had for this recording project, Mayan Chen, who is like just a ray, right? She's just a ray of sunshine. I mean,
Yeah.
You can't be mad when it's Mayanne. I've tried. I just can't. She's just too sweet. No, but she's also I haven't really tried. She's fantastic, but she's also just very competent at what she's doing. But it's this other layer of humanity that she brings, which makes her such a good fit for our kind of ensemble values in Morocco. So that was helpful too. Her enthusiasm, it's almost reflective. It's like you feel it and you see it. And so it just is. If you feel it and you don't see it, it isn't, right? Or if you see it and don't feel it, it isn't.
And this is also highlighting the significance of course, the live performance experience. Now, I don't want to take away from the whole theme of listening.
It's okay. I'm happy to go in and out.
But I will say, I mean, I think one thing we've really learned from this pandemic, we've learned a lot, is that nothing still compares to the literal physical live experience and the electricity of being in the concert hall. As much as live stream can approximate some of that, but it's not quite the same. And, and I don't want to go on and on about that, but I think while it is, what you're talking about is that kind of in-person energy, so to speak, that is just so important, especially in new music, to bring it to life, right?
100%. And I think what you're saying about live performance is absolutely true. The recordings of these experiences are just souvenirs. I hate to say it, but they are. And recording for the sake of recording is not actually such an artistically healthy act. In the sense that what you're shooting for is a perfect rendering of the score. And there's a bit of mental cohesion, which gets very thinky during the process. And so it was exhausting. I mean, when we did Visions Take Flight, it was exhausting in the best possible way, but it was completely different than it's live, it's down, accept it, move on. We record the dress rehearsal so they can, if anything goes absolutely sideways, we can plug it in, no problem, but it's more of an insurance policy. So I believe, when people are watching, listening to recordings, or they're listening to recordings of live performance in particular, it's really just like getting a postcard of the Grand Tetons. I mean, that's all it is. There's no, there's not that impersonal electricity. I'd say the energy comes down with the compression of the sound itself. You're not there. It's not permeating your body. And so it's just a souvenir. What can I say? So the live performance element is very important. Also, the fidelity of recording, I think, can help make it a little more realistic. So we're fortunate to have those resources. So, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'd love to hear more from your list now.
Okay. So there were a couple of other things, I think, which translate a little bit better to the visual medium, maybe to the recording medium. And this was not on our CD, but it was a piece by Maxime Goulet.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, and it was called Checkmate.
Yeah.
And it was a set of leitmotifs representing each of chess pieces. The queen, the rook, the king, all of the different pieces had their leitmotif, and they were presented at the beginning, almost Peter and the Wolf style, as an introduction before this actual match. And as the pieces moved, the different leitmotifs came in, and there was a projection of the actual match between Kasparov and Deep Blue going on behind the orchestra. And I believe we had Laura Downs. There was a piano part, which was sort of the orchestra was Deep Blue, and she was there basically representing Kasparov. So it was a match between the orchestra and piano, and then had the live match behind us. So for anybody who's been watching the Queen's Gambit or any, chess is kind of coming back in to the mainstream a bit. And that was just such a clever way of commemorating a very historical moment, but also engaging the audience in multiple levels of sensory experience.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm familiar with Maxime's music, some of his other pieces as well, and he's very creative in these kinds of things that people can relate to in a very sort of visual or even sensory way. I know he wrote a piece about chocolate, and
yes.
And having that kind of sort of concrete element to it, I think makes it really, really powerful and fun and interesting and dramatic. And so
Yes, it's really, I mean, I feel like I'm so busy teaching and playing whatever's in front of me,
Yeah.
that oftentimes that curiosity when I was a student, especially, when I was at Tanglewood doing the Fromm Fellowship and getting to know all of these budding composers and working with the faculty, there was a time where I felt really deeply connected with the current of new music. And I think playing in a full-time symphony orchestra plus doing a lot of teaching, there's only so much time to really do your R&D. So Roca's been a great way to keep my finger, in the socket, so to speak, of understanding what's happening and who these people are. It's pretty neat. Then there were a couple other very cute and clever pieces
Hmm.
that I thought worked well. One of them was by Brook,
Hmm.
and he's a Turkish composer. And he wrote a piece that was so interesting. It was called Wrestling Airs.
Hmm.
And it was for two davels, the Turkish kind of bass drum. They were
Hmm.
standing on either side of the orchestra, and they're loud as you know what. And then the chamber orchestra's there playing the music. And Urberk was in the front playing the MC of the wrestling match. So he transcribed this very famous wrestling championship with Koko Yusuf. So he
Hmm.
was a very famous Turkish wrestler. And so he was commemorating his biggest match. And so he was yelling in Turkish over these two davels and over the orchestra, basically as like the WWF match announcer, sports announcer, and like the intensity and the enthusiasm. You just realize like, oh my God, Turkish wrestling it's not like, oh look, let's go watch a match. It's just an all out like guttural, like cathartic experience from ancient times. And it was very, very cool. And I think the audience was like, I don't think they knew what was coming. And so it was fun to sit and kind of look at their responses, which were all kind of outrageous. And the piece itself was pretty outrageous in a great way,
Hmm.
and fun to play. And then there was another piece which was really funny. There's an oboist and composer, Alexander Miller,
Hmm.
just the nicest human being, great musician. And he composed a piece called Rokomoji,
Hmm.
and it was for a concerto for double reeds, so and chamber orchestra.
Hmm.
But it was well written. It was a very cool piece, and I know everybody there enjoyed playing it. And it had, but what was cool about it was that it was based off of emojis. So every so every movement was titled with an emoji. And as sort of, I think it'll be a great time capsule for this period of time where, I remember life before emojis. Now I'm
Yeah.
like, I emoji everything to a degree that I'm like, I don't think that's professional. So I'm deleting more emojis than I'm sending these days. But it was just such a clever piece. And one of them was the money emoji with the
Yeah.
face with the dollar coming out. And so he had the sound effect of a slot machine
Uh,
going on in the percussion. It was just great, just so creative and sort of well timed.
how does that
We'll
come across on an audio only, or does that have to be experienced with the visual element as well?
I think his piece works. From a sonic perspective, it was very clear that these were the effects that were being done. So in a way, there are some signposts in it that anybody could grab onto and know the meaning of, because they're sounds that we experience. Maybe not all the time, but if you've been to Vegas, you know. So just very clever, creative writing in general, and I think the culture of Rocco helps inspire works like that, because I think the composers feel supported and safe and going somewhere that they might not go if they were writing for, I don't know, a large symphony orchestra where there'd be maybe not as much support for a sort of more individual approach or clever approach. But I think we do invite that, which makes it fun for us too. One of the pieces I thought from our album Visions Take Flight, which was, I think, my favorite I have to say, no offense to any of the other composers, because I think they're brilliant and I love their music. But I think for my own taste in music, I really liked Karim Alzand, his piece Visions from Another World.
Okay.
And he took three illustrations of Gégé Granville, who's a French illustrator, kind of surrealist, and each kind of cartoon surrealist, almost like Alice in Wonderland style illustrations, but with like a Dali twinge. And they were all so, that word whimsical, I think it's just so overused. Like somebody's like, especially among the ladies, I just don't like the word whimsical that much anymore. They're like, look at these curtains. They're so whimsical. And I'm like, they're just curtains. Whimsical would whimsical kind of implies like a full experience to me, like a kind, you know, like a kind of transcendental, imagined world, an intensely imaginative world that would inspire me to say the word whimsical. So I
Maybe
really mean the
Sapphire Cat or something, not
what's that?
Sapphire Cat, in Alice in Wonderland or
Yeah.
something. But
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And it's the ensemble of characters, the ensemble of absurdity that creates that feeling.
Mhm.
And and his piece just drove that home. There's a kind of spinning ballerina movement at the end. And it is so much fun to play. And the feeling of spinning, you almost feel dizzy when it's over because it's just so relentless. And that the way he was able to capture that movement, that sensory experience was exceptional. I thought like it was more, it's like, when you imagine something and then you want to bring it to life, there's that challenge of, is this going to create, I know what I think the effect is, but is that the effect that it's going to have? Is it strong enough to really make that effect for the listener? And I feel that way when I play. Like, I know I feel this way about this phrase, but when I record it, does it represent the strength of what I'm feeling? And that's always a difficult line to toe. And I'd imagine as a composer, when you're sitting at your, composition desk and with your keyboard and all of these things, that it would be difficult to know that in the same way it would be for a writer or for, just a performer in general. So I thought that was just so effectively rendered. And it really did create a whimsical sense, which was just such a refreshing escape from heaviness. And I'm really into lightness in general. Like I love Italo Calvino's articles about lightness. If you ever have a chance, I don't know if you've read it, but it's just one of the most uplifting and kind of, I don't know, it just frees you a little bit, when you think about lightness, when you think about what that is and how to achieve lightness. And I thought that he just absolutely, I wouldn't say nailed it because that feels heavy, but
Right. And one of the things that I've also noticed in some of now in your another theme to bring about in your listening list here is again this pieces that are based on these really creative concepts in programmatic ways or in vivid imagery or in other kinds of sensory experiences, which often multiple sensory modalities too, not just
right.
art. And it's really wonderful to hear about this and to be highlighting these kinds of compositions, because while in the history of music, of course, there are programmatic pieces to a certain extent, I think we're in an era now, especially in the 2000s, where there's even more freedom to do this kind of work, perhaps as opposed to, forgive me, after the 1940s and 50s, the avant-garde, where the emphasis was so much on what's new. As much as I appreciate newness and innovation, but now we're actually in an era of, as a composer, I feel this, an era of greater freedom, where we don't have to necessarily conform to what the avant-garde is doing. so to speak,
Right.
which I know
Right.
it sounds a little contradictory, conforming to the avant-garde, but
But it's not.
but it's
And that's
not.
the
And
thing.
I felt like the
Yes.
avant-garde has actually had a stranglehold on me when I was a younger composer, and now I'm
Interesting.
feeling this tremendous freedom to do. Yeah, I wrote a viola concerto on Merlin, the legendary character, but that wouldn't
Amazing.
have been taken seriously in the 70s. So,
Right. You're not wrong about that. And I think my Tanglewood roots really do. I have a pretty firm grasp and understanding of what you're talking about. There's a there was a sort of very formal hold on dismissing what had come before and moving past it. It was reactionary. And I think human beings as a whole were quite reactionary at that time with World War II and all of the chaos and that feeling, that nihilism that sort of went along with it, the doubt or faith that people gained from that. It was either one or the other. So I mean, I have to say, like I've played, the Boulez Sonatine. I performed it. It was the most intense musical experience of my life of rehearsing for 5 hours a day for 3 weeks with the pianist. There's a picture of me laying on the floor like a homicide cutout. It it just was very hard. It was very hard, and it just seemed like one of those like jelly things that you try to hold in your hands and you think you got a hold of it and it just slips. But it's because you're always seeing some kind of new dimension or new possibility. There's so many ways of sensing and feeling that music, but the precision of the rhythm, the amazing virtuosity of the rhythm itself, of those meter changes and quick responses back and forth, that it's just like speaking in tongues. I mean, it really is just so bizarre. But the formal structure of the piece, I think, is quite effective. It's really dramatic, and I think that's where I think that the goal was to create these kind of three-dimensional structures that were almost like modern architectural pieces, and but getting that suspension of the actual structure, I think, is what is so challenging about playing that kind of music and also about listening to that kind of music. So I mean, I did a Carter centenary celebration where I had to play 5 Elliott Carter chamber pieces in 2 days.
wow.
Pinto, the triple duo, Esprit Rude, Esprit Doux 1 and 2, and then Enchanted Preludes for flute and cello.
Mhm.
So I was in Paris for 5 weeks before the festival started. Everybody was going to the Louvre, cabarets. We were playing in the Opera Comique every night, Porgy and Bess, with the New World Symphony. Great cast, amazing experience. However, I really didn't do a lot of tourism because I was in my hotel room studying Elliott Carter the entire time, which is fine. In the end, it was a beautiful thing to see him 100 years old coming, standing up in the audience, having, and it was a 2 week long celebration. I mean, it was something else.
Mhm.
So I know what you're talking about in terms of some of the more, I don't know, maybe the word to use is academic in some sense too, because I think that music lives well within that medium, within the
Mhm.
medium of learning, within the medium of sort of kind of ivory. I don't want to say ivory tower. I don't want to be like, I don't want to be condescending about it, because I think that music
Right.
has a lot of value,
Right.
intensely so, and it's had a big influence. But I think seeing this other side of this newer music has been really informative and fun for me too, because whenever I see a new piece, usually I'm like clinched, like, oh God, what's going to be in here now? But yeah, it is. These works that I'm sort of focusing on are, I wouldn't say gimmicky in any sense. Maybe they're very linked with the times, which I think is sort of what we need to be doing right now. I think when people go to concerts, they are looking to be entertained. So I took a chance and traveled to St. Bart's because they're having a music festival, and Robert Langevin from the New York Philharmonic is usually playing principal flute. And I thought probably won't get a chance to do this, at least not in anytime soon. So we were staying, as one does in St. Bart's, at this Mexican kind of hacienda villa type style thing that had been built there, and it had been owned by Mikhail Baryshnikov. So it's
Oh,
called the
wow.
Baryshnikov House. So I was pirouetting around the house and imagining. when I was in the bathroom imagining the grandeur of the same toilet as Mikhail Baryshnikov, I don't know, as one does. It was bizarre. It was almost surreal in a sense, but as one does. And so I was staying there actually with Alicia Lawyer from Rocco. We're really good friends. But our housemate was Jason Marsalis, who's the youngest of the Marsalis brothers. And he's a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant man, and someone who you can get into the dirt with. You can get into the details with him, and he doesn't shy away at all. So we had these conversations that I don't think I've ever had those types of conversations with any other human. So it was amazing. So he was talking about the avant-garde as applies to jazz, and applied specifically to the institutionalization of teaching jazz within higher education programs, and how that's led to a similar situation which happened to composers, I think, after World War II, where they were put into these institutions, learning institutions, which would essentially pay them. They could earn their money there teaching, and then they could do whatever they wanted. So that was kind of like the ideal situation.
Yep, that's
and
right.
Yeah, and it's still
Right.
happening, but it's changing. I mean, it was
Right.
a newer thing back then, and so it had a real shaping effect on that instrumental music. And he was talking about how, and I'm going to bring it home here, but he was talking about how jazz has changed in a similar way within the last 20 years, that jazz as a music was supposed to be a social music. It was supposed to have a very, very social role, an entertainment role, that most of the time you were playing, there were people dancing. So the style of percussion was very different. The style of playing, the way of engaging the audience was different. And he said, now I go to these concerts, I'm listening to these young players, and they think that's what's good, is not doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not learning, they're not really fully digesting the history of jazz and making informed decisions about the way they want to carry that tradition forward. Rather, they're being kind of pressured into following their acolytes of their leader, and that the music itself has kind of lost some of its entertainment value, I would say, and the engaging of the audience, that it's sort of almost in some respect left the audience behind. Mm-hmm. And so we were just sort of talking about that. And I talk to people often after contemporary music concerts, because I don't even like that, but new music. So I talk to them and say, what did you think? And a lot of them were like, I mean, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I liked parts of it. And so but then there are these types of concerts when you're employing some of these different elements that allow people to comment on something that they feel informed to comment on. Like, mm-hmm. I love the way those sounds interacted with the video, or I really appreciated how, I heard slot machines going off in this section, or familiar things. So I guess in some sense, what Jason and I were talking about, and jazz is going through it at a different time period, but it's a normal thing, I think, that happens when music detaches a bit from the listener, mm-hmm. and from the listener's relationship with the composer, the listener's relationship with the performers. And that detachment, I think, is in large part why new music is scary to audiences. I think it's why orchestras program new pieces at the beginning of the second half before the piece they're all waiting for, and after intermission. Sure. And that in itself speaks volumes, mm-hmm. about what is wrong.
Sure.
We shouldn't be worried about people walking out by putting the new piece last. That's ridiculous, but that's the relationship we've cultivated, mm-hmm. over time. And that's what people have kind of come to expect. So with Rocco, we completely avoid that. There is no program order. Uh-huh. You get a sheet, like a program book, with all the works listed and no idea about the order that they're going to fall in.
Oh, okay. I love that. What a concept.
Yeah. Yeah. and there's a kind of respect for the listener in the sense that long pieces are maybe not our thing so much. Like, we tend to, I think, keep it high and tight, with everything. Just get it out there, and see what happens. So I think that it's an interesting conversation to have. I think there's more available to artistic leaderships of larger organizations to be able to curate these types of experiences without alienating listeners.
Yeah.
And it's a tricky line to toe because, hey, I'm a First Amendment person. I want all my rights. I want every right that I am entitled to, right? So how I engage with those rights will be my choice. But in terms of freedom of speech or freedom of expression, writing, I don't think that people should be pandering necessarily. That's not what I mean.
Right.
But maybe the composer thinking in relation to others
Mm-hmm.
is where my heart lies. Is like when I know that when someone was writing something, they were thinking about me as a player. They're thinking about the audience and making it easy for us to present new pieces and to connect with people and have relationships with our audiences. So that's the new thing.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really a profound point that you're saying about the importance of the connection somehow being evident. And on top of that, I would also add, composers now think of various approaches that may be academic more, or some think about that may be more connective, so to speak. I mean, there are, and it's not like one excludes the other, but I've come across both.
Right.
And so when you have those different dichotomy, then it's also up to the conductor and the performers to with the curation process to sell it in a way that will engage the audience, bring the audience in. And I know there are lots of new music ensembles that are very effective at doing that, even with music that can be very dissonant or very academic or very and part of it has to do with the audience they're serving, but I think it's possible with the right kind of performer and the right conductor and all of that to make that experience really, really engaging. And I've talked with a number of people in the field in this blog in previous episodes about how they, in like the Eugene Symphony, for example, how they commissioned a new symphony, and it was a whole symphony.
That's great.
And they performed it, and the audience was totally bought into that experience. And yes, it was on the end of the program.
Yay! Hurrah!
Right?
Well, I think you're right. I think there's a like, if you have that level of trust with the people who love what you do, there is room for everything, right? And I guess the tricky part is, over the long term, how do you build that trust and connection so that when you push your audience further, that only serves the organization, right? Because it opens up more possibilities of what you can do. So it's just a tricky balance to keep that moving forward and to kind of opening up the minds of your listeners a little bit more as you go, and understanding that we're not here to necessarily always entertain you. Sometimes you're not going to like what we do. And we want to hear about that too. We want to hear why you didn't like it. Sometimes a part of experiencing art is a negative reaction, quite frankly. Like I think we did a piece by, I hope I'm getting this right, but I think it was Judith Shayton who did a piece about, these icebergs just falling off into the ocean and the destruction of the world. And it was very static, and it was I thought it was very colorful. I mean, but I like Feldman. So, I mean, it was kind of had that vibe. And I think some people were it was a little too real or something, but I heard very varied responses from that. And I think controversy is also an important element in art and intention. The tension of everyday life that can be represented that way. So there's a place for everything, but I think your audience knowing that you're in relation with them can get you a lot further down that road,
Well, I think that's absolutely spot on. And, I really appreciate that perspective.
But I did listen to Gloman.
Yeah. Oh,
very
really?
Nice. Very nice.
Oh,
I liked it. I checked it out. I love that the piano part is just so, I mean, the flute part's fantastic, but I think a lot of times when we play things that are that virtuosic, there's a sort of leave the pianist behind tradition. And I love that there was no musician left behind here.
Oh no,
But
not at that piece.
yeah,
My pianists
the
are
heart,
like, this
they're
is
like, there's,
I'm an equal player in this.
and there's a terrifying passage for piano. I think it's like all 30-second notes or something that with the MIDI, it seems as if the melody is augmented in that passage. So if you were playing it in like real life, like it would expand and it would sound, like shaped in a certain way, but on the recording it's like, and I just I thought it was so great. I was just like, oh my gosh, if only we could play that way, but it was
I have a commercial recording of that.
I had the one, I think it was from your website, which I have to listen to, but I will listen to the commercial recording. It's a great piece. I love, is it Gaelic? Is that the Gloamin?
Gloamin, yeah, the Twilight. Yeah. But I didn't think I had the MIDI on my website. Okay, well,
if it isn't, then it's an astoundingly accurate performance, and it was really neat. And I loved all the dotted rhythms and the march and kind of like fantasy elements of it, and and some of the harmonies with the march, like it was like oscillating in and out of some very familiar things that I have really deep associations with, but I won't say because I don't want to bias the listener. But everybody should check that out. Flute players should check it out because it should be played more.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Wow.
Cool piece. Yeah.
Well, just to wrap up, I was just wondering if you had any sort of, concluding thoughts about, the listening list and some of the things we talked about and audience engagement. It's been a really, really wonderful conversation here, and I very rich with everything that we've talked topics here. So, did you have anything else you wanted to just add?
Sure. I think just briefly, as a kind of cap on this, I would just encourage organizations to rethink the best way that they can create relationships with their audience members, authentic relationships, not just, oh, did we get them to come back? Do we have the metrics for that? You should just know because you'll see them there and you'll go talk to them, to your public. And I think so much of the online ticket sales, this kind of transactional approach is quite detrimental, I think, to the art form and to being in relationship with your audience. So I would just encourage organizations, big and small, to not let their relationship with their audience be determined by tradition. That we learn now different skills and different ways of reaching people in an authentic way, and that becomes the focus of our work rather than any other element. And I think, in fact, it can help all of us have more artistic freedom and trust with one another. Also, deeper support. And when you're in deeper relationship with your audience, you get deeper support as well. So it's just win-win for everybody. In any case, it was just such a delight to talk to you. I was a little nervous before this because normally interviews are like, how do you play the flute? Or, they're all fluty. So, but this was such a fun exploration. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have had you and to talk about these issues. And I look forward to talking again with you another time. Thanks.
Yes. Thanks so much. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.